Vermont, December, the kind of cold that has no patience for hesitation. From above, if you could see it from above, the mountains fold into each other like sleeping things, white on white on white, and somewhere in all that silence, a single road cuts north and disappears into the trees. One road, no name on any map, and at the end of it, buried in the pines on the side of a ridge, a cabin that has not had a light in its windows for 15 years. Move closer. The porch. 3 padlocks on the front door, chains, and on the second lock scratches, fresh ones. Someone was here recently. Someone tried. Someone failed. Move closer still. A girl, 19, standing at the edge of the clearing with 2 backpacks and $23 and a brass key in her fist. She looks at the locks. She looks at the scratches. She already knows what they mean. She puts the key in anyway. She was 19 years old, sleeping in someone else's car in a supermarket parking lot in Burlington, Vermont. December, the kind of December that doesn't apologize, the kind that gets into your bones at 2 in the morning and stays there, reminding you of every decision that led you to this exact moment, this exact parking lot, this exact borrowed car that smelled like pine, air freshener, and old coffee, and someone else's better life. Immo was asleep in the back seat, 12 years old, mouth open, one shoe on one shoe somewhere under the seat because he'd kicked it off somewhere around Montpellier, and neither of them had the energy to find it. She watched him breathe. That's what she did now when she couldn't sleep, when the cold pressed through the window glass and the parking lot lights buzzed that particular shade of yellowish white that made everything look like the inside of a waiting room. She watched Immo breathe, and she counted the seconds between each one, and she thought, okay, still here. $23 in her coat pocket, not 23 and some change. Exactly 23. She'd counted it twice in the gas station bathroom 2 hours ago, under the fluorescent light, over the sink that dripped. She'd spread the bills out on the edge of the sink and laid the coins in a row and counted them the way you count things when counting is the only thing you can control. $23 and a brass key. She'd been carrying it for 4 years. Small, old-fashioned, the kind of key that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale or a museum or anywhere except the front pocket of a 19-year-old girl's coat in a parking lot in Burlington, Vermont, in the middle of a Tuesday night in December. Her mother had given it to her. Not given, pressed. There's a difference. Giving is when you have time, when you wrap something, when you hand it over with a smile and watch the other person open it. Pressing is what you do when you don't have time. When you're in a hospital bed and your hands have gone thin and the monitors are making sounds you've learned to not look at. When you pull your daughter close and press a key into her palm and close her fingers around it and say the thing you need to say before you run out of breath to say it. Keep this, and don't open the letter until you're really out of options. Seren had kept the key. She had not opened the letter, not when her father left 8 months after the funeral, not when the school started asking questions she didn't have answers to, not when she'd figured out how to forge his signature on the permission slips and the insurance forms and the things that required a responsible adult, which was apparently not her, even though she was the one making dinner and making sure Immo got to school and making sure the lights stayed on. Not even when the letter came from the county, the one about the benefits, the one that said there was a problem with Immo's date of birth. Someone somewhere in the system, in the vast indifferent machinery of the state of Vermont, had typed one wrong number in one field on one form, and that one wrong number had flagged their file as invalid, and the flag had triggered a review, and the review had triggered a hold, and the hold had lasted 90 days. They didn't have 90 days. The landlord had given them 14. She'd spent 3 of those days calling, being put on hold, being transferred, being disconnected, and calling back and being told the case had been reassigned and the new caseworker was unavailable, and could she call back Thursday? She'd called back Thursday. The caseworker was in a meeting. She'd called Friday. The caseworker had been out sick. Monday, the caseworker was on vacation until the second week of January. So, January. Great. Perfect. They could just what exactly? Float, evaporate. She'd asked that question out loud to the phone to the hold music. The hold music had continued playing. It didn't have opinions about this. The notice came on a Tuesday. 7 days. She packed what fit in 2 backpacks and 1 duffel bag. She made Immo choose 3 things. Just 3. He'd chosen his sketchbook, his good pencils, and a stuffed bear named Gerald that he would have been embarrassed about if she'd mentioned it, so she didn't. She chose their mother's coat, the key, and the letter, still sealed, still waiting. She'd found Orla at a gas station outside of Burlington. Not found exactly, more like collided with. Seren had been inside paying for 2 granola bars and a bottle of water, counting coins at the counter, while the teenager at the register watched her with the particular expression of someone who is pretending not to watch, and Orla had walked in behind her and stood in line, and after a moment had said quietly, not making a thing of it, "Is there enough?" Seren had said yes. There was not enough. Orla had put a 20 on the counter. Seren had said she couldn't. Orla had said, "I'm not asking, I'm telling. You look like someone who needs to get somewhere, and I've got a car that needs to feel useful." She said it the way people say things when they've been alive long enough to have stopped wasting time on the preamble. No explanations, no conditions, just a 20 and the keys to a car that smelled like pine and old coffee, and the quiet certainty that some debts aren't paid back to the people you owe them to. "Where are you going?" Seren had pulled out the map, the hand-drawn one, old paper barely holding together at the folds, mountains in the margins, a road with no name, a creek marked with a tiny X and the word noisy, and, at the top in her mother's handwriting, an address, a property, the name Bexley Vaux. Orla had looked at the map for a long moment. Then she said, "I know that road," and that was that. She'd carried the clock for 4 years too. Pocket watch, small, silver-cased, or what had once been silver. The surface had gone warm and dark with age, the way things do when they've spent enough time in human hands. The chain was missing. The crystal over the face had a crack running from 7 o'clock to the center, and the minute hand sat at 5 past forever because it had stopped moving a long time ago. But here's the thing about that clock. It was almost right. She'd figured that out when she was 16 in the back of the watch repair shop where she'd gotten a part-time job because it was warm and the owner, Mr. Trevi, didn't ask too many questions and paid cash on Fridays. She'd been cleaning the display case when she'd taken the pocket watch out of her bag. She carried it everywhere, habit, comfort, something to hold, and Mr. Trevi had glanced over and stopped what he was doing. "May I?" She'd handed it over. He'd opened the case and looked inside for a long time, put it to his ear, tilted it left, then right. Then he'd looked at her with an expression she hadn't been able to read at the time, but understood now. The expression of someone who has just found out that a thing they assumed was ordinary is not. This movement is intact, completely intact. Every component, every spring, every wheel, every jewel bearing. He'd paused, except one gear, one specific gear, gone, not broken, not stripped, just absent, as if it had been removed deliberately, as if someone had taken out exactly the one piece that would keep the clock still without destroying everything else inside it. "It's not broken," Mr. Trevi had said. She'd heard that before, once, from herself, when she was 4 years old and she'd picked up a damaged pocket watch at some family gathering she didn't remember and held it to her ear and said to the room, to no one in particular, "It's tired, not broken." She didn't remember saying it, but apparently someone else did. The back of the clock had 4 numbers worn into the case. Faint. She'd thought they were decorative. She'd thought a lot of things were decorative that turned out to be something else entirely. 12/25, December 25th, her birthday. She'd looked at that for a long time, the night her mother pressed the clock into her hands, along with the key, the night the monitors were making sounds she'd learned to look away from. She'd wanted to ask. She'd had so many questions. She'd opened her mouth to ask one of them, and her mother had shaken her head, barely, just barely, not now, not yet, and then there was no more yet. Stowe in December. If you've never been, and most people haven't, or they've been and stayed in the resort part, the part with the heated sidewalks and the ski shops with the pretty windows, but if you've ever been to the part of Stowe, that's just a town, just a main street with a gas station and a hardware store and a church that needs paint and a general store with a hand-lettered sign that says, "Grun's Established, 1963. If you've been to that part, then you know what it smells like in December. Wood smoke, cold stone, something baking somewhere, and underneath all of it, the particular sharp edge clean of mountain air at 20 degrees, the kind that finds every gap in your coat and introduces itself personally. The bus had dropped them at the edge of town. The driver hadn't asked questions, just nodded at the stop and opened the door and let the cold in along with a few dry snowflakes that immediately vanished against the warm interior of the bus. Seren had grabbed both backpacks. Immo had found his missing shoe somewhere around White River Junction and was now wearing both, which felt like progress. They stood on the sidewalk. "Is this it?" Immo said. "No, this is the town. The cabin is further." "How much further?" She looked at the map, at the notation her mother had made in the margin. "Grun's first. Ask at the counter. First, we need to go to the store." Immo looked at Grun's general store, at the wooden sign, at the window display of canned goods and seed packets and a hand-lettered card that said Vermont winter hours and listed a closing time of 5 o'clock. It was 4:47. "Okay," he said. That was it. "Okay. No complaints, no, but I'm tired, or but I'm hungry, or can we just okay," because he was 12 years old and he'd already learned that some situations don't leave room for okay to mean anything other than let's keep moving, and she hated that he'd learned that. She hated it in the specific way you hate things that you couldn't have prevented. She pushed open the door of Grun's, a bell above the door, the smell of sawdust and old wood and something sweet, honey maybe, or dried apples or 60 years of dry goods absorbed into the floorboards, shelves from floor to ceiling, packed with the orderly disorder of a store that sold everything and had decided years ago that organization was less important than having whatever you needed somewhere on the premises. A man behind the counter. Old, 70-something, maybe older, white hair, hands that moved with the practiced slowness of someone who had been doing the same work for most of a lifetime and had made peace with the pace of it. He was marking something in a ledger with a pencil, and he didn't look up right away. Seren approached the counter. She set the map down. He finished his notation, capped the pencil, looked up, and stopped. Not a dramatic stop, not a gasp or a step backward. Just the ordinary motion of his looking up came to a halt, and he became very still, and his eyes moved from her face to the map and back to her face, and something happened in his expression that she didn't have a word for, like recognition, like the particular feeling of a clock that's been wound finally after a long time of sitting stopped. Where did you get that? It was my mother's. My great-grandmother drew it, I think. A pause. What was her name? She hesitated. Bexley Vaux. Percival Grunn's hand went to the edge of the counter and held on. He closed his eyes for 2 seconds. 3. When he opened them, they were wet at the corners, which he did not acknowledge and she did not mention. 15 years, he said. He said it quietly, not to her exactly, more like he was reporting a fact to the room, to the shelf of canned peaches, behind her to the particular quality of the late afternoon light coming through the window. 15 years, the way you say a number that has gotten heavier the longer you've carried it. He turned, moved to the shelving unit behind the counter, the one built into the wall, the one with the little drawers and cubbies, and the general sense of having been added onto over decades as storage needs arose. He opened one of the smaller drawers near the bottom and took out an envelope, brown with age. The paper had gone soft at the edges, the way things do when they've been handled occasionally, but carefully over a long period of time. Her name wasn't on the outside. There was no name, just a single word in handwriting she didn't know yet, but would spend the next weeks learning to recognize the way you recognize a voice. Wait. That was all. One word, wait. She came in, Percival said. It was 2010, I think, middle of November. I remember because it was the first hard frost and the window over the door had frozen in its frame, and I'd been fighting with it all morning. He turned the envelope in his hands. She bought 3 things. She was always doing that. Coming in. 3 things, cash, no small talk. She came in for 30 years, gave or take. Always the same. He looked at Seren. That last time she gave me this envelope, and she said she told me to keep it. Behind the counter. She said someone from her family would come asking about the cabin. A young woman, she said. She was specific about that. Young woman, coming on her own. A pause. She said she'll have a clock that's missing a piece. Give her the envelope. Seren felt something move in her chest. Not a feeling she had a name for. Something that was not quite hope and not quite fear, and was maybe both of them at the same time pressing against each other from the inside. She looked down at her coat pocket, at the small round shape of the pocket watch through the fabric. She took it out. Percival looked at it, nodded once as if confirming something he'd suspected. He opened the envelope. Inside, not a photograph, not a letter, a small object wrapped in a square of velvet cloth, dark green tied with a piece of white string. He unwrapped it slowly with the deliberateness of someone who has practiced this moment in his head many times and wants to do it correctly. A gear, tiny, brass. The teeth were perfect, no wear, no damage, no age on them at all. It had been protected, wrapped and kept and protected for 15 years in a drawer in the back of a general store in Stowe, Vermont, by a man who kept his promises. Seren knew what it was immediately. Her hands were already moving, already opening the case of the pocket watch, her mother's pocket watch, her great-grandmother's pocket watch, the watch that hadn't moved in 4 years because something inside it was missing. She turned it over, located the absent space in the movement, and pressed the gear into place. It seated with a click so small you could have missed it. She didn't miss it. The minute hand moved. One tick, then another, then the clock was running, not lurching, not struggling, just running steady and even, the way it was always supposed to run, the way it would have run if someone hadn't deliberately removed this one piece and sent it on ahead to wait. She stood at the counter of Grun's general store and held a running clock in her hands and felt 4 years collapse into about 3 seconds. She said, Percival said quietly that the girl would come. She said you always keep your promises. Seren couldn't speak for a moment. Emo was looking at the clock, then at her, then at the clock. It's running, he said. Yeah. How? The piece was here, waiting. He thought about this with the methodical seriousness that he brought to most things. Then he said Nonna kept a piece of the clock here so it couldn't run without coming here first. She looked at him, 12 years old. Yeah, she said, that's exactly what she did. Percival gave them directions, the logging road, the creek, the particular shape of a gap in the tree line that she'd know when she saw it. He told her the road would be bad, in this weather soft ground, under the snow, maybe 20 minutes of walking once they left the main road. He offered to call someone to drive them. She said they'd walk. He nodded like he'd expected that. He didn't charge them for the granola bars and the bottle of water she'd set on the counter at some point without thinking. Just bagged them alongside the envelope and handed the bag across. She paid for those, how, he said. 15 years ago, she left enough for whatever you'd need when you came through. Said the change was for my patience. He managed a small smile. She had a sense of humor, Seren said. She had a lot of things. Most of them she kept to herself. He paused. You'll understand when you get up there. The gap in the trees was exactly where he said it would be. A break in the white pine on the left side of the road, narrow enough that you'd miss it if you were driving, wide enough if you were looking. A trail, not a road, really not anymore. More like the memory of a road, the ghost of one. Years of neglect had softened the tire ruts into gentle ridges and filled the gravel with moss and thin saplings that reached across from both sides, and the snow had come down over all of it, like a sheet laid carefully over furniture in a room no one was using. They walked. Emo carried his own pack. He didn't complain. The snow was a few inches deep and the trail angled upward gradually, the kind of grade that you don't notice until you've been climbing for a while and you realize your calves are burning. The air smelled of cold pine and something underneath it, earth water, the particular dark mineral smell of a mountain creek somewhere nearby. Then she heard it, water, moving over rocks, persistent. The sound the creek makes, the sound it always makes. Apparently the sound that whoever drew the map had noted with the word noisy, and she thought there. We're close. Around a final curve where the trail widened into a clearing. She stopped. Imo walked into her from behind. Why are you? He started. Then he saw it too. The cabin sat in the center of the clearing, like it had been there since before the clearing existed. Stone chimney, covered porch, 2 stories. The wood had gone silver with years of weather, the specific silver gray of old timber that has passed through many decades of Vermont weather and come out the other side, not rotted, not ruined, just changed, aged into something that looked permanent, load-bearing. the kind of structure that knows what it was built for. Every window was shuttered, heavy wooden boards nailed tight. The front door had 3 padlocks, 3 separate chains, 3 industrial locks, not old rusted forgotten locks. These had been chosen and placed and locked with intention. Whatever was inside had been sealed, not abandoned, sealed, by someone who planned for it to be opened again by a specific person at a specific time. But the locks. Seren stepped closer, already knowing what she was going to find before she found it, because she'd spent 2 years working in a watch repair shop, learning to see things that were slightly wrong before she had language for what the wrongness was. Scratches around the first lock and the second, fresh ones. The metal of the lock body was clean where it shouldn't be too clean, wiped the patina disturbed by something metallic, trying to find purchase where no purchase was intended. Someone had tried to open these locks recently enough that the disturbed snow around the base of the porch steps hadn't had time to blow smooth. Boot prints, leading up, leading away. The particular compressed shape of someone standing in one place for a while, working at something, then leaving in a direction that was not back down the trail, but around the side of the building. She put her hand on Immo's arm. Someone's been here. He looked at the snow, at the prints, back at her. When? Recent. Like today, recent. She studied the prints. The edges were still crisp. Snow hadn't blown into them yet. Yesterday, maybe this morning early. Immo was quiet for a moment. Are they still here? She looked around the clearing, the tree line, the shadows between the white pines, the silence of the place, which was not empty. It had the particular texture of a silence that has been holding its breath. But nothing moved, nothing made a sound except the creak and the wind moving through the upper branches. No, she said, but they didn't get in. She took the brass key from her pocket. It had been next to the running clock all the way up the mountain, the two of them together, in her coat pocket, for the first time since her mother pressed them both into her hands, and she'd been aware of the warmth of it the whole walk, the way you're aware of something important that you're carrying and haven't opened yet. The first lock. She slid the key in, felt the mechanism engage and turned. Click. The lock opened. Smooth, easy, like it had been oiled last week. The second lock gave just as cleanly. The third was stubborn. 15 years of Vermont winters had gotten into it, and the mechanism resisted stiff with cold and time and the particular obstinacy of metal that has been ignored for too long. She worked the key back and forth, applying pressure, changing the angle. Immo stood beside her and didn't say anything, and she was grateful for that, for the quality of his silence, which was never empty, but always with her, always in the room. A grinding sound, a resistance, and then the sudden absence of resistance. Click. The chain slid off. She pulled the boards from the door using a flat stone from the foundation steps, working them loose one at a time, stacking them on the porch. Immo helped without being asked. They didn't talk. The boards came away, and behind them was the door itself, solid oak, dark with age, fitted with an iron handle and a keyhole that was old enough to have been made for exactly the key she was holding. She looked at Immo. His breath made small clouds in the cold air. His face was serious in the way his face always got serious when something mattered, not scared, just present. Ready? He nodded. She put the key in. She turned it. The bolt drew back with a sound she felt more than heard. Deep, certain. The sound of a thing that has been waiting a long time to do exactly what it was made to do. She pushed the door open. The hinges gave a sound long, low, the groan of wood and metal that has been still for 15 years, remembering how to move. not protest, something else, the sound of a house exhaling, the sound of a thing that knows its purpose and is prepared to resume it, dark inside. The smell of it came first, cedar and dust and time, not rot, not decay, just years, just the particular preserved stillness of a space that has been sealed carefully against the world and has kept itself intact. She raised the small flashlight from her pack. The beam moved across the room, and the first thing she saw, the first thing the light found before she'd fully registered what she was looking at, was the clocks. Everywhere. Wall clocks, shelf clocks, a tall case clock in the corner with its pendulum stopped, glass-fronted cases along the far wall holding smaller pieces, pocket watches, wrist movements, the careful accumulation of someone who had spent a lifetime with these things and could not stop bringing them home. And all of them, everyone had stopped at a different hour, no two the same time, a room full of clocks that had each stopped in their own moment, frozen at whatever hour the last winding had given out, and the result was a wall of hands pointing in every direction, a frozen explosion of time, arrested midstream, and it should have looked like neglect, but it didn't. It looked like a library, like a room where time had been collected. Immo stepped in beside her, and his flashlight found the shelves, and then the clocks, and then the bench along the far wall, the long wooden workbench with its drawers and its tools arranged with the precision of someone who used them daily and knew exactly where each one belonged. She was a watchmaker, he said, not a question. Yes, like you. I'm barely apprentice level, like you, he said again, firm, like that was settled. She looked at the bench, at the tools, at the loop hanging on a hook, the tweezers in their stand, the small wooden tray of tiny gears and springs and wheels that had been sorted and labeled in handwriting she recognized from the map. She was 19 years old. She had $23. She had a key that had opened every door it was made for. She had a clock that was running finally for the first time in 4 years, and she was standing in the workshop of a woman she had never met who had apparently, impossibly specifically, been watching for her for a very long time. She put her hand flat on the workbench. The wood was cold, old, worn smooth in the center where decades of hands had rested while doing precise and patient work. From somewhere in the back of the cabin, behind a wall or beneath the floor, she couldn't tell yet, the sound of the creek came through, constant, quiet, the sound the water made going over rocks that had been in that same spot since before the cabin existed, before the clearing was cleared, before anyone drew a map with the word noisy in the margin because they wanted whoever came after them to know it's loud here. It sounds like something. Immo moved deeper into the room. He stopped at the far wall, at the biggest clock, the tall case clock in the corner. He looked up at it. They all stopped at different time. He said, "Yes, but yours is running." She looked down at the pocket watch in her hand, still running, steady, 12:25 on the case, the minute hand moving, the second hand sweeping, every component doing exactly what it was made to do now that the missing piece had been returned to it. "Yes," she said, "mine is running." He pulled out his sketchbook. Of course he did, because that's what Immo did when something mattered, when something needed to be understood or kept or remembered. He drew it. He sat down cross-legged on the dusty floor of Bexley Vaux's workshop and opened to a fresh page, and he began to draw the wall of clocks, all of them, every face, every position of the hands, every stop moment frozen in that room. Seren stood and watched him. She thought about a woman she'd never met who had been here in this room for 30 years, who had wound these clocks and set them running and then at some point stopped, let the springs run down, let the hands stop where they stopped, let the room go quiet and sealed it shut and sent a key and a gear ahead to wherever they needed to go. She thought about all the things a person could do with 30 years in a room full of clocks. She thought about patience, the kind of patience that doesn't mean waiting, the kind that means trusting that the piece you've sent ahead will find the clock it belongs to, trusting that the door will open for the right hands, trusting that the thing you've built will hold. Outside the snow was falling, inside one clock was running, and in the drawer of the workbench, though Seren didn't know it yet, in the drawer that was third from the left, the one with the small brass pull, the one she would open tomorrow morning when the light was better, there was a notebook, cloth covered. The ink inside had darkened with years. On the third page in handwriting, she was already learning to recognize a date, September 14th, 2011, and below it a name, hers. The notebook was third drawer from the left. She found it on the second morning, not the first. The first morning she'd been too busy surviving, getting the stove lit, melting snow for water, because the pump handle was frozen solid and she wasn't ready to fight it yet, figuring out which of the canned goods on the shelf were still safe and which had swelled enough to throw away. The first morning was logistics. The first morning was just keeping them warm. But the second morning, Emo woke up before her, which almost never happened, and she heard him in the kitchen attempting to do something with oats and the cast iron pot, and the sounds he was making suggested confidence, significantly outpacing competence. So she had approximately 4 minutes before something required her attention. She used those 4 minutes, went to the workbench, third drawer from the left. The brass pull was small and worn, and her fingers found it like they'd found it before, which was impossible, which didn't stop it from feeling true. Cloth cover, brown, the kind of notebook you could buy at any general store in 1990 and most of them after that. Inside the pages had gone cream-colored. With age, the ink darkened from whatever it had started as to something closer to rust. The handwriting was precise, careful, the handwriting of someone who had learned that permanence requires effort, that things written in haste don't last, that if you want something to survive, you have to make it with the same attention you'd give a gear train, small pieces, exact tolerances, nothing wasted. She turned to the third page, September 14th, 2011. That was the date, and below it, 5 lines. There was a child at the Dunmore gathering, 4 years old, pulled a damaged movement off the side table, someone's broken pocket watch that had been there long enough, nobody remembered whose it was. She held it to her ear. She closed her eyes, and she said very seriously, to no one in particular, "It's tired, not broken. I don't know if anyone else heard. I heard. I am writing it down because I believe in writing down the things that matter before you forget them. I am 73 years old. I cannot afford to forget. Her name is Seren." Seren stood at the workbench in Bexley Vaux's cabin in the mountains of Vermont and read her own name in ink that was 15 years old and did not breathe for what felt like a long time. From the kitchen, a sound of something scraping. Then, "I think it's fine," she exhaled. "Is it burning?" "It's not burning, it's more like committed." She closed the notebook, held it against her chest for a moment, then set it back in the drawer, walked to the kitchen. The oatmeal was in fact committed. Adhered was maybe the more accurate word. To the bottom of the cast iron pot, with a dedication that suggested it had been there for years and had no plans to leave. But the top portion, the part that had not yet achieved permanence, was fine, edible, hot. She scraped what she could into 2 bowls and added the crystallized honey from the jar on the shelf, and they sat at the table and ate in the particular silence of 2 people who have been through enough together. That silence between them is not empty. It means something. It holds things. Through the window white, mountains, snow still coming down soft and slow, the kind that doesn't announce itself. She knew my name, Seren said. Immo kept eating. He'd already found the notebook. Of course he had. He'd been awake longer. She wrote it in 2011, he said. You read it. I read everything. She looked at him. I know, she said. He scraped the last of his oatmeal, set down the spoon, looked at the window the way he looked at things he was planning to draw later, cataloging, storing. She picked you on purpose, he said. Not a question, not wonder, just a fact he was placing on the table. Yes, before you knew she existed. Yes. He nodded, filed it away, went back to eating. Seren thought 12 years old. 12 years old, and he receives the information that a woman who died 15 years ago chose his sister specifically and deliberately and with forethought, and he responds by nodding and finishing his breakfast, because the world has already given him plenty of stranger things, and he has made his peace with the strangeness of it. She thought, I will not let this world make him old before he gets to be young. She thought that starts here. The notebooks were not the only things Bexley had left. There were 3 of them. Total Seren found the second 2 over the next several days, each in a different place, each requiring a slightly different kind of looking, which she suspected was intentional, not a puzzle exactly, more like a curriculum, the kind that only reveals the next lesson when you've spent enough time with the previous one. The second notebook was in the back of the clock parts cabinet, behind a tray of mainspring coils. This one was more technical, years of notes on specific movements, on the particular character of certain calibers, on the way different metals behaved in cold weather versus warm. But threaded through the technical notes at irregular intervals were other things, observations, remarks, the kind of thing you write when you've been alone long enough that your notebook becomes the closest thing to a conversation. April 1998. Watched a fox cross the clearing at dawn. It stopped at the edge and looked at the cabin for a long moment. I had the distinct impression it was assessing my situation and finding it adequate. November 2003. The east window has been sticking since the cold came in. Pull from the bottom, not the top. I keep forgetting, and I keep writing it down, and I keep forgetting. Perhaps whoever reads this after me will remember better than I do. March 2006. Sap running. 3 families from town came up to tap the maples at the edge of the property today and brought me a jar of last year's syrup as payment. I told them the tapping rights were free. They brought the syrup anyway. I have come to believe that this is how most human exchanges actually work. Someone says no payment necessary, and someone else brings syrup anyway, and both of them know this is correct. She read that one twice. Then she went and looked at the east window. Tried to open it. It stuck. She pulled from the top. Nothing. She pulled from the bottom. It opened. She stood there for a moment holding an open window in a Vermont December cold air, coming in snowflakes, landing on the sill, and immediately beginning to melt from the interior warmth of the cabin that was slowly becoming warm again after 15 years. I told you, she said to the empty room. And the room said nothing back, but she had the feeling, the particular unverifiable, entirely irrational feeling that something in it was satisfied. On the third day, Orla Petch came, not to the door, not with a knock. Seren was at the workbench. She'd started cataloging the tools, making a list of what was there and what condition it was in, because that was the kind of thing she needed to understand, and because working with her hands was the only thing that had ever reliably turned the volume down on the inside of her head. And she heard boots on the porch steps and looked up, and a woman's shape was visible through the gap in the boarded window, moving deliberately, setting something down, not knocking, just setting something down and leaving. Seren went to the door. On the porch, a cloth bag. Inside the bag, a technical manual, cloth-bound and hand-stitched, the kind of thing that doesn't come from a publisher. The pages inside were dense with handwriting and diagrams, cross-sections of movements, step by step, disassembly notes, the accumulated knowledge of someone who had spent 30 years doing something and had written down everything they learned, because they knew eventually they wouldn't be there to answer questions in person. And on the inside front cover, in the now familiar handwriting, for whoever comes after, pay attention, it's all in here. No note from Orla, no explanation, no name, just the manual left on the porch, the way you leave something at a door, when you know the person inside is not ready for conversation, but is ready maybe for this. What happened on day 5 was Orla. Orla arrived in the mid-afternoon, which was earlier and less anonymous than the porch drop. She knocked. Seren opened the door and found a woman, 74 maybe, with the face of someone who had spent decades outdoors and had opinions about people who hadn't, standing on the porch with no food, no gift, nothing in her hands at all, just herself. "You found the manual," Orla said. "Yes." "Did you read it?" "I started." "Start again, from the beginning. Don't skip the section on lever escapements, even if it seems elementary. She wrote it last, and it's the most important part." Seren looked at her. "You knew her well," she said. Orla was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone deciding what kind of answer to give. "In 1993, she said finally, "I was having a winter that made yours look easy. Don't ask me the details, they're mine. But I was here in this town in a situation that I could not see a way through, and someone left a bag of groceries on my porch. No note, no name, just food." She paused. "I found out years later it was Bexley. By accident. She never told me." Seren said nothing. "She did that," Orla said, "all the time, for years, for more people than you'd think. She never expected anything back. She never told anyone. She just did it." Another pause. "I'm not a particularly warm person. I want you to know that, so you don't make the wrong assumption about why I'm here. Okay, I'm here because she did something for me and I could never pay it back to her, so I'm paying it forward. That's all." She looked at Seren very directly. "Don't make it sentimental." "I won't," Seren said. "Good." A beat. "Do you want to come in?" Seren asked. "No, I want to go home. It's cold." She turned and started down the porch steps, then stopped, half-turned. The manual, the section on mainspring installation. There's a note in the margin on page 47 that looks like a mistake. It's not a mistake. Read it 3 times before you try it. And then she was gone, down the path, into the tree line, the snow closing over her footprints almost immediately, the way Vermont winters do, the way mountains do, without drama, without ceremony, without anything that looks like it's trying to be a metaphor. Seren stood in the open door. The cold came in around her. She was thinking about a woman she'd never met who had kept 30 years of secrets and had died in 2011 without ever hearing thank you from most of the people she'd helped. She was thinking about a grocery bag left on a porch in 1993 with no note and no name. She was thinking about a gear left in an envelope in a general store with instructions to wait. She was thinking about her mother, pressing a key into her hands. Keep this, and don't open the letter until you're really out of options. Her mother had known about the cabin, had known about Bexley, and had deliberately chosen to let Seren find it herself when she was ready, when there was no other door. Because that's what you do, she thought, when you want someone to understand what they've been given. You don't hand it to them, you make them walk to it. She closed the door, put her hand flat on the workbench. The wood was cold, but warmer than it had been yesterday, and warmer than that the day before. Something in her that had been clenched very tightly for a very long time, since the hospital room, since the parking lot, since the 14 days and the 2 backpacks and the 1 shoe. Something in her recognized that it was allowed here to be less tight, that this was a room where it was safe to put down some of what she'd been carrying. She opened the manual to the beginning, and she started again. Weldhan arrived on day 7, 68 years old, the kind of man built for cold weather, substantial, unhurried, with the hands of someone who'd spent most of a life making things. He came up the trail mid-morning, carrying a toolbox that looked older than Seren knocked once, and when she opened the door, he said without preamble, without introduction, "The soffit on the east side is going to be a problem by spring if someone doesn't look at it. I'm someone." She looked at him. "I don't know who you are," she said. "Weldhan. I built the workshop extension." He nodded past her toward the back of the cabin, toward the section that housed the clock workbench. 1994. Bexley needed more space and couldn't afford to pay me, and I didn't need to be paid. Felt like the right thing at the time. Why? He thought about this for a second. Because she'd fixed my grandfather's pocket watch the year before and refused payment, and it was the most valuable thing my family owned, and she just handed it back running. He shrugged slightly. Seemed fair. Seren stepped back from the door. He came in, looked around, looked at the workbench, the tools, the sorted parts she'd been cataloging all week, organizing, creating order from the beautiful, disorganized accumulation of Bexley's years. Something crossed his face, something between recognition and satisfaction, the expression of a man who has been wondering for 15 years whether the thing he built would be used. "You're a watchmaker," he said. "Apprentice level. Where'd you train?" "Small shop, Burlington, 2 years." He looked at the bench. "That's enough to start. She could teach herself anything. Probably you can too." He didn't wait for a response to that. Went to work on the soffit. He showed her while he worked how to read the structure of the cabin, which joints were load-bearing, which were finishing work, which could be left, and which needed attention before the deep cold of January settled in and made everything 10 times harder. He didn't lecture. He demonstrated, then watched, then corrected with a word or a gesture, rather than taking the thing back and doing it himself. He treated her competence as a given, not as a surprise. She thought about how rare that was, how rarely anyone in the whole of her 19 years had assumed she could figure something out before she'd proved it, how much energy she'd spent proving things she already knew. On his way out in the late afternoon, he paused at the door. "She told me once," he said, that the problem with clocks is everyone thinks they're about time. They're not. What are they about? Patience. He pulled on his coat. Same thing maybe, but not the same thing. He left. She thought about that for the rest of the evening. The envelope slid under the door on day 9. She didn't hear it happen. She was in the workshop with the manual open to page 47, the section Orla had mentioned, and she was reading the margin note that looked like a mistake and definitely wasn't. And Emma was asleep upstairs, and the cabin had gotten genuinely warm by this point, the stove doing its job, the banked fire at night, the accumulated warmth of a structure built specifically to hold heat against a Vermont winter, and the world outside had gone white and still and genuinely quiet. She found the envelope when she went to the kitchen for water, cream-colored, legal size. The return address was a law office in Stowe, crisp printing, the kind of envelope that has opinions about itself, inside 2 pages, dense language, the kind that takes up space efficiently and means more than it looks like it means. She read it once fast, then sat down, then read it again slowly. Her name, Seren Vo. Notice of intent to challenge property rights. Request to provide documentation of legal residency and ownership claim. Reference to the estate of Bexley Vo and the instrument of conditional management authority signed in the year 2008, and a name at the bottom, Cillian Vo, her father's brother. The uncle she'd met exactly twice, once at her mother's funeral, where he'd shaken her hand without meeting her eyes, and once before that, so long ago, she only had the impression of him rather than the memory, a large person who smelled like coffee and looked at the cabin on the hill with the expression of someone doing arithmetic. She'd forgotten he existed. She suspected that had been his plan. Okay, she thought. Okay. And then immediately he's been here. He's the prince in the snow. He tried the locks and they didn't open, and so he went to a lawyer instead. Of course he did. Of course. She read the document a 3rd time. 10 days. She had 10 days to provide documentation. She didn't have documentation. She had a brass key, a running pocket watch, a hand-drawn map, and an envelope that had been kept in a general store for 15 years by a man who didn't need a reason beyond, I keep my promises. She had notebooks in faded ink with her name in them. She had a missing gear that fit a specific watch that no one else on earth could have known about. None of that was documentation, in the legal sense, in the sense this letter was asking about. Okay, she set the letter on the table, put her palms flat on the surface, looked at the grain of the old oak, at the patterns in the wood that looked like rivers seen from very high up. Okay, think. Dr. Lund. Orla had mentioned him 2 nights ago offhand, in the way she mentioned things, dropping information without ceremony, as if she expected Seren to know what to do with it. If you need a lawyer in Stowe, there's Dr. Lund. He does property work. He's not cheap, but he's honest, which in my experience is rarer. She had a phone. Signal out here was inconsistent, but there was one spot she discovered it on day 4 by accident, standing near the north corner of the porch, with her arm raised in a specific way that she felt ridiculous about, but had replicated daily, since where 2 bars appeared reliably. She called Dr. Lund's office. She got voicemail. She left a message, her name, the situation in brief, the 10-day deadline, hung up, stood on the porch in the cold with her arm still raised slightly and the phone still in her hand. And then, because she was 19 and it was cold and she had just received a legal notice from an uncle she'd forgotten existed, who had apparently been to her cabin and tried to open her locks, she allowed herself approximately 45 seconds of standing in the snow doing nothing at all before she went back inside. 45 seconds. That was what she could afford. Cillian Vo knocked on the door at 11 o'clock at night. Not 11 in the morning. 11 at night. As if he'd calculated, and he had, she understood. Later he definitely had that a 19-year-old girl alone in a remote cabin would be at her most uncertain at 11 p.m. in a Vermont December when the snow was coming down hard and the nearest town was 7 miles of bad road away. She was not asleep. She hadn't been asleep. She'd been at the workbench with the manual and the small lamp and the particular focused calm that comes from working with your hands on something tiny and exact and unforgiving of inattention. The knock was not aggressive. That was the first thing. She'd expected aggressive. She'd steeled herself for aggressive, but the knock was measured, the rhythm of someone who considers himself a reasonable person making a reasonable visit. She opened the door. He was taller than she remembered. Expensive coat, not showy, just the particular expensive of someone who buys things that last rather than things that look like they cost money. Gray at the temples, the arithmetic expression, the one she half remembered from childhood, fully present now. He looked at her for a moment, then passed her into the cabin, at the lamp on the workbench, at the technical manual, at the tools arranged neatly in their places, at Bexley Vo's workshop, which had been sealed for 15 years and which was now undeniably inhabited. Something shifted in his expression, not displeasure, more like recalculation. "Seren," he said. "You've been here before," she said, not a question, a pause. "I came to assess the property after the letter from the lawyers. You tried to open the locks." Briefer pause. "I wanted to verify the state of the structure." "With a pick set." His expression didn't change, which was itself an answer. "I'm not here to fight," he said. "I want to talk. It's 11 o'clock at night. I drove a long way." She didn't move from the doorway. One hand on the frame, one hand on the door, the cold coming in around her. Behind her upstairs, Emma was asleep. She checked before the knock in the way she always checked, the way she'd been checking for 4 years, the habit of knowing where he was and whether he was breathing. "Come in then," she said. He came in. He looked at the cabin the way he'd looked at it from the doorway, methodically, taking inventory. Not the inventory of someone who wanted to live here, the inventory of someone who wanted to understand what they had. He sat at the table. She stood. He put a folder on the table. She recognized the format, the same letterhead, the same legal density, the same crisp opinion of itself as the envelope that had come under the door. "In 2008, he said, when Bexley was hospitalized, the first time, the serious time, the family agreed that someone needed to manage the property. She had no children, no designated heir that we knew of. I volunteered. The instrument is legal. It's been reviewed by 2 separate attorneys. What does it say? That in the absence of a direct living heir, management of the estate falls to the nearest eligible family representative, which is me." Seren looked at the folder. She thought of a notebook with her name in it, written in 2011, in ink that had had 15 years to darken. She thought of a gear in an envelope, of a key that opened every lock it was made for. She thought of a woman she'd never met who had apparently spent a significant portion of her final years making sure this moment, this exact moment, was not the end of the story. "I have a lawyer," Seren said. He looked at her steadily. "Good. You'll need one. Not cruel, not triumphant, just true. I don't want to take this to court, he said, and she believed him not because he was kind, but because courts were expensive and unpredictable, and men like Cillian Vo preferred the outcomes they could calculate. But I will if I have to. This property has been untouched for 15 years. The taxes have been managed through a trust that is set to expire. If no legitimate heir establishes a claim within the next... Oh, I'm her great-granddaughter, Seren said. I know. Direct line. I know. He was still steady, still calm. The question is whether that claim supersedes the management instrument. That's what lawyers argue about. He stood, picked up his folder, looked around the cabin one more time, at the clocks on the walls, at the bench, at the lamp, at the manual open to page 47, at a room that had been sealed for 15 years and had been alive for 9 days and showed no signs of stopping. I don't dislike you, he said. I want you to understand that this isn't personal, and that was almost worse than if it had been, because at least personal meant she mattered. At least personal meant she registered as something more than an obstacle in an equation. He went to the door, opened it. Cold came in. Your lawyer, he said without turning around. Make sure they read the full instrument, not just the primary clause, the full document. Then he was gone. The door closed. The cold settled back. From upstairs, Seren, she looked up. Immo was at the top of the stairs, pajamas, one sock, the bare Gerald under his arm, in a way that was absolutely not for comfort, and she was absolutely not going to say anything about. I heard, he said. I know. What are we going to do? She looked at the folder she'd taken from the table when he wasn't looking, at the legal instrument, at the primary clause, and whatever came after it that Cillian had almost but not quite told her to read. She thought of Dr. Lund, who had called back that afternoon and asked for the documents and promised to look at them over the weekend. She thought of Orla. He's not cheap, but he's honest. She thought of Bexley Vo, who had known in 2010 that someone was going to do exactly this and who had done something about it, quietly, without announcing it, in the way she did everything. We're going to let the right person read the right document, she said. Immo looked at her for a moment. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now. He considered this. Okay, he said, and he went back to bed. She turned the lamp back on, picked up the manual, turned to page 47, read the margin note again, the one that looked like a mistake. Outside, the snow came down in the dark, steady, and unhurried, the kind that accumulates without drama, without announcement, without anything that looks like it's trying to prove a point, the kind that gives nothing away. And in the workbench drawer, in the notebook with her name in it, the third page was still there, still waiting, the ink still patient. Her name is Seren. I am writing it down because I believe in writing down the things that matter before you forget them. I am 73 years old. I cannot afford to forget. The lamp burned, the fire held, the clock on the mantel, the one she'd wound that afternoon, the first clock she'd gotten running since arriving, kept its steady beat. 1 second, then another, unhurried, exact, patient in the way that only something very precisely made can be patient, as if it had been doing this all along. The storm came on the 6th night without asking permission. That's the thing about Vermont winters. They don't negotiate. 1 hour, the sky was clear and the stars were out in their full mountain abundance, the kind of sky you only get above 4,000 feet, where there's no light pollution and no haze, and no one around to remind you that the universe is indifferent to your specific problems. And then the next hour, the wind shifted. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in 20 minutes, and the snow came sideways. Seren woke up because the cabin was groaning. Not the pleasant settling sounds she'd learned over 10 days, not the creak of old timber adjusting to the cold, the familiar conversation of a structure that knows its own seasons. This was different. This was the sound of a building bracing, the deep structural moan of walls built to handle exactly this handling, exactly this doing the job they were made to do, while everything outside tried to argue otherwise. She lay still for a moment, listening, wind, high and sustained, the kind that finds every gap. Then a sound from the north corner of the workshop. She was up before she was fully awake, down the stairs, flashlight on, and the north window, the one she hadn't gotten around to resealing yet, the one where the putty had dried out over 15 years, and she'd noted it on her list and hadn't gotten back to it, had given, not broken, shalken, just surrendered. The frame had flexed in the sustained pressure of the wind, and the seal had let go, and now there was a gap at the corner, and the cold was coming through it with direction and intention. She grabbed a folded blanket from the shelf, pressed it into the gap, held it there. It helped. Slightly. The wind pushed back. Okay, she thought. Okay, we're doing this. She needed something more solid. She needed to cover the window properly. She thought of the boards she'd stacked on the porch, the ones she'd pried off the windows when they arrived, stacked neatly against the railing because she couldn't bring herself to leave them in disorder. Those boards. She needed one of those boards and something to hold it in place. She put on her coat over her pajamas. Her boots, without lacing them, just shoved her feet in and held them by the intent. Opened the front door. The storm hit her like a conversation she hadn't been prepared for. Cold that was a physical thing, that had mass and speed and absolutely zero interest in her comfort or her timeline. She found the boards, found the one she needed wide enough, got both hands on it. The wind tried to take it. She held on, got back inside, got the board up against the window frame, needed to hold it and also nail it, which was not possible with two hands that were already doing one job each. She wedged one end against the wall, shoulder against the board, both hands free for approximately 4 seconds. Found the hammer, found a nail, first swing, missed, hit the wall, second swing, found the nail, drove it in. Splinters in her palm from the board, fresh cuts on top of the blisters from the original unpacking, on top of days of tool work, on top of years of surviving things that required her hands to be in the middle of them. She didn't stop. Third nail, fourth. The board held. She stood back, looked at it, breathing hard, hands bleeding slightly. The wind still screaming outside, but the gap closed. The cold still in the room, but no longer entering with forward momentum. There, she thought. There. And then from upstairs, "Mom," she went still, because Immo had not called her that since they were 8 and 6, and the world still had both parents in it, and the word had a clear and obvious recipient. He'd stopped saying it the day their mother stopped being there to answer it. He said Saren now, always Saren. She went upstairs. He was sitting up in bed, eyes half open, face flush. She put her hand on his forehead before she'd fully registered, crossing the room. Hot. Not warm from sleep hot. Hot in the particular way that means something has been building while you weren't watching. The kind of heat that radiates before your hand makes contact. The kind that hits you in the wrist first, and then the palm. Okay? Not okay. Okay. Think. She sat on the edge of his bed. "I'm cold," he said, which meant he was running a fever high enough to make him feel cold when he was hot, which meant it wasn't low grade, which meant she needed the medicine cabinet, the one in the back room of the workshop, the one she'd found on day 4 when she was cataloging and had opened and then stood in front of for a long moment, not quite able to process what she was looking at. She'd thought someone was very organized. Then she thought, this is too organized. This is organized with purpose. The cabinet was not a general medicine cabinet. It was not the accumulation of a person's health needs over decades, the random collection of half-empty bottles and expired cough syrup and the specific aspirin brand someone's doctor recommended in 1987. It was stocked, deliberately, like someone had thought about what would be needed. Children's fever reducer, correct weight range for a child of approximately 10 to 45 kilograms, electrolyte solution, 2 bottles sealed, a thermometer, glass case still in its paper sleeve, a cloth for compresses, already cut into squares, already hemmed, at the edges folded, with the particular neatness of someone who had folded things all their life and had decided that even unwitnessed tasks deserved to be done with care, and a card index size, written in the now familiar handwriting, for a child running fever, keep the compress cool, not cold, replace every quarter hour. The second bottle of electrolyte is under the towels on the left shelf. Don't let them sleep through the night without checking. They'll argue with you about it. Let them argue. Check anyway. Siren had read that card 4 times on day 4. She'd put it back, closed the cabinet, gone back to her cataloging. She'd thought, this is specific. She'd thought, this cannot possibly be as specific as it looks. She'd thought, I'm going to think about this later, when I have the capacity to think about things that don't have immediate practical implications. Later was now. She took the thermometer, went back upstairs, took his temperature with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before, who had been the person in charge of fevers since she was 15, because the alternative was no one being in charge. 103.4. She stood in the doorway of his room for a moment, looking at the number. In her mind, very clearly, a line she'd drawn when she'd read the card 4 times on day 4 and put it back. 104 is the number. If it hits 104, we try for help, whatever that means, whatever that looks like in a storm in December in the mountains, we find a way. 103.4, not there yet. She went back downstairs, got the medicine cabinet, got everything she needed, set it up with the methodical speed of someone for whom speed and method are not opposites. She sat beside his bed for the rest of the night. She replaced the compress every 15 minutes. She checked the temperature every hour. She talked to him when he was awake, not about anything that mattered, not about Cillian or lawyers or 10-day deadlines, just whatever came. The creek, whether there were fish in it and what kind, the clocks on the wall downstairs and what she knew about each movement, whether Gerald the bear had an opinion about Vermont winters. Gerald says it's fine, Immo said at 2 in the morning. Gerald is from Minnesota. This is nothing to Gerald. She laughed, actually laughed in the cabin in the middle of the storm, sitting beside her 12-year-old brother at 2 in the morning with her hands still raw from the board and the hammer. The laugh surprised her. It surprised him too. He opened his eyes further and looked at her with the slightly unfocused focus of a child with a fever, and then something in his face got quieter and softer and more itself, the way his face only got when the performance of being fine fell away far enough to let the actual Immo through. "Are we going to be okay?" he said. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what a 19-year-old girl with $23 and a brass key and a running pocket watch could honestly say to a 12-year-old boy with a fever in a storm in a cabin in December, "Yes," she said, "but not because it's easy, because we're good at this." He thought about that, closed his eyes. "Gerald agrees," he said. The fever peaked at 103.8 at 4 in the morning, did not hit 104, began to fall at 5. By dawn, it was 101.2 and dropping, and the storm had eased from screaming to muttering, and the sky outside the bedroom window had gone from black to the particular blue-gray of a Vermont morning that is deciding whether to give you sun or just give you more gray. And Immo was asleep properly, asleep, the deep boneless sleep of a body that has fought something and won. And Seren was in the rocking chair by his bed with the technical manual open in her lap at page 47, which she had read enough times now that she almost had it memorized. She closed her eyes, opened them. The margin note looked back at her, patient, unhurried. "I have been doing this wrong for 20 years. Bexley had written in handwriting, slightly smaller than her usual, the way people write when they're writing something they find embarrassing. The instinct is to tighten. When the mechanism resists, tighten. Apply more force. Push past the resistance. This is wrong. This has always been wrong. The correct response to resistance is to stop, to listen, to find out what the mechanism is telling you about itself rather than telling the mechanism what you want it to do. Everything I know about people I learned from clocks. I'm not sure what that says about me. I suspect it says something." Seren sat in the rocking chair as the light came up and thought about that for a long time. Dr. Lund drove up the logging road on day 13, which meant he'd driven, himself, 7 miles of mountain road in a December that had made its opinion about convenience very clear. Seren heard the car before she saw it, the particular sound of tires on packed snow, careful and deliberate, someone who knew the road or had decided to treat an unknown road with the respect it was probably owed. He parked at the edge of the clearing, got out. 45 maybe, the practical build of someone who spent more time in courtrooms than gyms but walked everywhere he could. He was carrying a briefcase and a thermos which told her something. The briefcase said he'd looked at the documents. The thermos said he'd been at this long enough to know that the cold was a variable you planned for. He looked at the cabin, at the cleared porch, the restacked wood, the window she'd resealed, the smoke coming from the chimney, the signs of a place being actively lived in rather than occupied. Something in his face did the small recalibration thing. "Dr. Lund," he said. "I know. Come in." He came in, looked at the workbench. The running clocks, she had 7 of them going now, which she considered a reasonable week's work. The tools organized in their places, the manuals and notebooks stacked with the care of someone who understood that information was a form of infrastructure. He set the briefcase on the table, opened it. Inside Cillian's documents, and what she recognized from the photocopied pages as additional materials, county records, estate filings, correspondence. He'd done more than read what she sent him. He'd gone looking. "I need you to know," he said, "that I've been doing property law for 20 years, and I've seen a lot of instruments designed to look like one thing while being another thing. This one," he set a document on the table, "is actually what it claims to be. I want to be honest with you about that." Her stomach dropped. "Approximately 2 inches. "Okay," she said. "The 2008 instrument is valid, properly witnessed, properly filed. Cillian had standing to sign it because at the time there was no known direct heir. He paused. At the time, she looked at him, and now he took a second document from the briefcase. Older paper, heavier, official seals at the top, the kind that took effort, that required a notary and an appointment, and the deliberate choice to make something permanent. Bexley Vo filed a supplemental clause addendum in November 2011, notarized, witnessed by two parties. It clarifies the term direct living heir in the original estate instrument to explicitly include direct biological descendants of any generation, including great-grandchildren. He set it flat on the table. She also specified that no conditional management authority shall supersede the claim of a direct biological descendant who has physically occupied the property and demonstrated intent to maintain it. Seren looked at the document, at the seal, at the date, November 2011, 2 months after Bexley had written her name in the notebook, 2 months after that family gathering, that 4-year-old girl, that broken pocket watch held to a small ear. She filed this after she met you, Seren thought. She met you in September. She came home, and she went straight to a notary. She knew Cillian had signed the 2008 instrument. She had a copy. Docker looked at her. She didn't try to invalidate it. She added a clause that made it irrelevant under specific conditions. A pause. The conditions are direct biological descendant, physical occupancy, demonstrated intent to maintain, which you unambiguously meet. Seren sat down, not because her legs gave, but because sitting seemed like the right relationship to have with the room at this particular moment. So Cillian's instrument is valid, Dacre said, until a direct heir establishes the conditions, which you have, which means the instrument has been superseded under its own supplemental terms. He almost smiled. Not quite. Your great-grandmother was either a genius or a spy, possibly both. She was a watchmaker, Seren said. Same skill set, different application. She looked at the November 2011 document, at the seal, at the handwriting in the supplemental language, which was typed, dictated probably to a notary who typed it up with Bexley's signature at the bottom firm and cleared the signature of someone who had considered this moment and decided it was worth the effort of being undeniable. Orla Petch, Docker said. She called me. Before you did, actually. Seren looked up. She was a witness, he said, to the 2011 filing. Her name is on the document. She's had a copy this whole time. He paused. She also kept contemporaneous notes of the conversation during which the addendum was explained and signed. Bexley walked through every clause. Orla wrote it down. Because Orla writes things down. Because Orla was there, and Bexley asked her to be there specifically so that there would be someone who could say what happened in that room if anyone ever needed to say it. And there it was, the thing Bexley had done that Seren hadn't seen yet. Not just the gear in the envelope, not just the notebook with her name, not just the medicine cabinet with the compressed instructions. The thing behind all of those things, the deepest layer of the preparation. She had put a human witness in a room and asked that person to remember, and that person had remembered for 15 years through the particular faithful stubbornness of someone who had been given something important to hold and had held it. Dacre assembled the documents, put them in a separate folder, set it on the table in front of her. I need to send Cillian's attorneys the supplemental addendum and Orla's witness statement, he said. After that, this shouldn't require a courtroom. Shouldn't, she said. Shouldn't. I've been doing this long enough not to say won't. He picked up his briefcase. But I've also been doing this long enough to know when someone planned for a specific outcome. He looked around the cabin one more time, at the clocks, at the bench, at the 7 running movements, each ticking in its own time but together making something larger. She planned for this outcome. He left. She sat at the table for a while, just sat. The call from Cillian's lawyers came 4 days later. She was in the workshop. Lever escapement, the one from page 47, the mechanism she'd been building toward all week, and it was working. That was the thing. It was actually working the pallet fork, engaging the escape wheel at exactly the angle the manual described, the whole assembly doing what it was built to do with a precision that still surprised her every time she achieved it, because she'd grown up believing precision was for other people, for people who had the right teachers, the right tools, the right conditions. The phone rang. She answered. A lawyer's voice, measured, professional, the voice of someone whose job was to communicate outcomes without editorializing about them. He explained in clean and efficient language that his client had reviewed the supplemental addendum and the witness documentation and had concluded that pursuing the matter further was not in his interests. He's withdrawing, Seren said. My client is withdrawing the notice of intent. A pause. Is there anything else he wants me to know? Another pause, slightly longer. He said, and I'm conveying this as stated, that he'd underestimated what his aunt had prepared. She thought, yes, you did. She said, thank you, hung up, sat for a moment with the phone in her hand and the lever escapement on the bench in front of her, ticking the escape wheel, turning one tooth at a time, the whole small mechanism doing its precise and patient work. She thought Bexley had known Cillian would try, had known it the way you know things when you've lived long enough to see patterns repeat, had not been angry about it, had not tried to prevent him, had simply made a plan, filed a document, asked a witness to remember, and then gone back to her bench and her clocks and let the mechanism do its job. Because that's what you do, Seren thought, when you understand that most problems are not about force. They're about having the right piece in the right place at the right time. She found the letter on a Thursday, the sealed one, the one in the cabinet that she was honest enough with herself to use the word avoiding, not because she was afraid of what it said, more because she understood by now that Bexley had sequenced everything deliberately, and some things you weren't meant to reach until you'd gotten through the others first. She'd gotten through the others. The notebook, the manual, the medicine cabinet, the legal document, Orla's witness statement, 7 running clocks, MMO's fever broken, Cillian's withdrawal, the lever escapement working. She picked up the letter. The envelope was cream-colored paper, her name on the front in letters that had been drawn with care, the kind of care that knows it will only write this once. She sat at the workbench, opened it. 2 pages, dense but not cramped, the writing of someone who had space for what they needed to say and had used it proportionally. She read it once, fast, the way you read something when you need to know the shape of it before you can absorb the content. Then she put it down, looked at the wall of clocks, then picked it up and read it again, slowly, the way it was written to be read. My name is Bexley Vaux. I have been a watchmaker at this bench since 1971, 40 years of listening to things people called broken. I want to tell you something about that, about what 40 years of broken things teaches you. It teaches you that broken is almost never accurate. The word people mean is stopped, stalled, missing a piece, waiting. Those are not the same as broken. Broken implies damage. Damage implies that the original condition was better and cannot be recovered. In 40 years, I have almost never found that to be true. What I find instead is patience, or the absence of it. The clocks that people bring me are not broken. They are waiting for someone who will sit with them long enough to hear what they're trying to say about themselves. The clock knows where its problem is. It always does. The job of the watchmaker is not to impose a solution. The job is to listen until the solution becomes obvious. I have been watching you for 15 years, Saran, not in a way that I could defend as practical or reasonable, in the way that you watch something you believe in from a distance, because you understand that getting closer would change what you're watching. I saw you once. You were 4 years old. You picked up a damaged pocket watch and held it to your ear, and I thought that child already knows the most important thing. The rest is just practice. I am leaving you this workshop, not because I think you need it. You would have figured something out. You always would have. I am leaving it because I believe that the right tools in the right hands at the right time should not be a matter of luck. And I had the tools, and I could see whose hands they belonged to. Some practical things. The spring under the floorboard in the northeast corner of the workshop does not connect to the cabin's water system. I built a separate line in 1989 that runs cleaner than the main. Use it for anything precise. The third cabinet from the wall has a false back. Nothing dramatic behind it, just documents. The deed, the property survey, the correspondence with the county. Everything you will need to know about what you own. All of it yours. The tall case clock in the corner has not run in 20 years because I could not find the specific caliber of mainspring it requires. I have left a note inside the case with the specifications. I believe you will find it. I believe once you find it, you will not stop until it runs. I am not going to tell you that everything will be fine. I don't know that. Neither do you. What I know is that everything will be worth attending to, which is different and better. The people who love your money are never the people who love you. Trust the ones who show up when you have nothing. I hope this helps you, Saran. I hope it teaches you that being taken from is not the same as being empty. And I hope when you are very old, you will find someone worth leaving something to. Bexley Vo, November 14, 2011. She set the letter down. She did not cry immediately. She sat at the workbench for a moment, looking at the letter and not looking at it, at the same time aware of the clocks ticking around her, 7 of them, each in its own time, the collective sound of them, something that wasn't quite music, but had the same effect, filling the space in a way that made the silence between the notes mean something. She thought about 40 years. 40 years at this bench. 40 years of other people's broken things. 40 years of sitting still enough and being quiet enough and patient enough to hear what a mechanism was trying to say about itself before you tried to fix it. She thought about her mother pressing the key into her hand in a hospital room and saying, "Keep this," and then running out of breath to say anything else. She thought about Orla in 1993 with a bag of groceries on her porch and no name on the note because Bexley had never needed credit, had never wanted it, had just done the thing and gone home and done it again. She thought about a gear in an envelope that had been waiting 15 years in the back of a drawer in Grun's general store, and a man named Percival who had opened the store every morning for 15 years and kept his promise every single one of those mornings because someone had asked him to, and some people, it turns out, are exactly as reliable as they need to be. She thought, I have been taken from. She thought I am not empty. And then she cried. Not dramatically, not the kind of crying that collapses you, the kind that comes out of someplace very specific, that has been waiting very patiently for the moment when the pressure was finally finally allowed to go somewhere. 2 minutes, maybe 3. Quiet. At the workbench that Weld Hahn had built in 1994 in payment for a debt he'd felt himself owe. Then she wiped her face, and she went to the tall case clock in the corner. She'd looked at it every day since arriving. The largest piece in the room, mahogany case darker with age than with finish, the grain visible through whatever had been applied to it decades ago. The face was hand-painted, a pastoral scene in the arch above the dial, faded now to something impressionistic, more suggestion than image. Moon phase dial above the hour and minute, a door in the case that opened to the pendulum, which had hung still for 20 years. She opened the case door. Inside, taped to the inner wall, a note, index card, the specifications for the mainspring. She read them once, made a note on the back of an envelope she had in her pocket, closed the case. She went to the parts drawers. She had been cataloging these since day 2. The third drawer from the right she knew had mainsprings, various lengths and strengths and widths accumulated over decades, sorted and labeled in Bexley's precise hand. She went through them methodically, checking the specifications against the note. Third one she tried, matched. She carried it to the bench, spread her tools, worked slowly by the light of the small lamp in the way that page 47 had taught her, not with force, not with the instinct to push through resistance, but with attention. Stop, listen, find out what the mechanism is trying to tell you about itself. The mainspring went in. She closed the movement, set it back in the case, reattached the pendulum, gave it one small push, and held her breath. The pendulum swung once, and again, and again. The tick was deep and resonant, the particular sound of a large movement in a wooden case, the kind of sound that filled a room differently than the small sharp tick of a mantel clock. It was the sound of something substantial finding its rhythm. She stood very still, listening, counting the seconds between beats to make sure they were even. They were even. The tall case clock in the corner, which had not run for 20 years, was running. She stood in the middle of Bexley Vaux's workshop and listened to it, and felt for the first time in a very long time like something had been completed, not finished. Completed. There is a difference. Finished means done. Completed means the piece that was missing has been found and fitted, and the whole thing is finally doing what it was always supposed to do. The phone rang on a Sunday morning. 3rd week in the cabin. January now, just barely. The days were still short and the cold was still absolute, and she had gotten good enough with the stove that she could bank it in the night, and it would still be producing reliable heat at 5 in the morning, which was when she woke up now, which was a fact about herself that still surprised her. Burlington prefix. She looked at the number for a long moment. She had not answered the last time. She'd let it ring and looked at the ceiling and listened to the creak through the wall and told herself she'd deal with it later, and later had come and she dealt with it by not dealing with it, which was a strategy she recognized as impermanent. She answered, Seren, her father's voice, lower than she remembered, slightly less certain. I heard you're up at the Vaux property. Yes. A pause, the kind that contains more than a pause, usually holds. Are you? Is it good? Is it what you needed? She looked around the workshop, at the running clocks, all 8 of them now, at the bench with its tools, at the manual open to a new section, at the window with the resealed frame, at the woodshed visible through the glass, half full, still enough for the rest of the winter, and then some. Yes, she said. Good. Another pause. Your mother always said she said that place would be right for you. I didn't understand what she meant. Seren said nothing. I think I understand now, he said, or I'm starting to. She looked at the tall case clock, at its pendulum swinging, at the steady, certain arc of it, the same arc, the same length, the same time, unhurried, exactly right. Immo wants to see you, she said. Silence. I know I don't. He wants to see you, she said again. This summer, if you want to come. A longer silence, the kind that means a person is recalibrating, adjusting, taking something in that they were not prepared to receive. Yes, he said, I want to come. She nodded, though he couldn't see it. Okay, she said. She did not say, it's fine, because it wasn't entirely. She did not say, I forgive you, because that was a process, not a declaration, and she was in the middle of it, not the end. She did not say anything that wasn't true. She said okay, because okay was true, because okay meant this door is open, enough, for now. She ended the call, sat with the phone in her hands for a moment, the creek talking to itself outside, the clocks measuring the seconds with their 8 different voices, none of them quite in sync, all of them doing their job. From the kitchen, who was that? Your dad. The sound of Immo stopping whatever he was doing, a long pause, and he's coming this summer. She heard him set something down, then nothing for a while, then quietly, okay, just okay. The same word she'd given her father, the same weight it carried, the same careful door held open, just wide enough for whatever came through it to come through on its own terms. She put the phone down, went back to the bench. Spring came to the mountains the way Bexley had described in the notebooks in negotiations, not announcements. A warm day, then a frost. A crocus at the edge of the clearing, then snow. The creek getting louder as the thaw worked its way down from the upper slopes. And then one morning Seren opened the front door and the air smelled different, lighter, like something had been exhaling all winter and had finally finished. She'd gotten 7 more clocks running, 15 total, 15 movements that had been stopped, some for years, some for decades, each one waiting for the right attention in the right conditions with the right tools and the right amount of patience to listen before pushing. The woman from town had come back, the one whose mother's clock she'd fixed in January. She'd brought her sister this time, who had a mantel clock from their grandmother's house, and the sister had brought her neighbor, who had a pocket watch, and the neighbor's husband had come along and ended up leaving without the pocket watch, but with a standing appointment to bring it back in 2 weeks. Orla came every few days, never announced, always with something coffee, a jar of last year's preserves, once a hammer she thought Seren could use and was right about. They sat sometimes and sometimes didn't. The silence between them had gotten comfortable in the way that silences only do when neither person is using it to avoid saying something. Weld came twice a month to check the structure. He was also teaching Seren the exterior maintenance of the cabin, the specific language of old timber which joints spoke to what, where to look for the first signs of what would need attention before it became a problem. You're thinking like a clockmaker, he'd said once. Good. Same thing. Listen before you fix. She was at the bench on an evening in late April when Immo came in from outside. He'd been down at the creek. He went there most afternoons now, sketchbook in hand, drawing the water and the rocks and the particular way the light moved through the trees at the edge of the clearing, which changed every day and which he was documenting with a patience and precision that reminded her sometimes of someone else. He sat at the table, opened his sketchbook, showed her. He'd drawn the clearing, all of it, the cabin, the trees, the woodshed, the path down to the creek itself. And in the clearing in front of the cabin, he'd drawn the clocks, not inside where they were, outside in the clearing where they would be visible from a distance. A dozen clocks, all different shapes, arranged in the grass, each one showing a different time. "What is this?" she said. "What I want to make," he said. "Next summer, when I have the right materials." She looked at the drawing, at the clocks in the grass, at the care with which he'd rendered each one, the shadows, the light on the faces, the precise position of each set of hands. "You want to put clocks in the yard," she said. "I want people coming up the road to see them from a distance and know something about this place before they arrive." She thought about that. What would they know? He looked at his drawing. "That someone here pays attention," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. 12 years old, and he'd just described in 8 words what she'd spent the whole winter learning, and couldn't have said that cleanly on her best day. "Okay," she said. He nodded, went back to drawing. She went back to the bench. The pocket watch was in her hand. She'd been carrying it all day the way she always carried it now, not from habit but from choice, because it was running and because there was something about the weight of a running mechanism in your palm that was different from everything else, something that said, "This is doing what it was made to do." December 25th, the day she was born, the combination Bexley had chosen for the lock on a safe that held the final thing she wanted to leave. Not money, not property documents, not anything with a dollar value attached to it. A notebook with 47 names. She'd read through it twice since finding it, each name with its note, each note a small and specific record of someone helped anonymously without expectation of return, in the way that things are done when you understand that repayment isn't the point. The point was the doing, the accumulation of it. 47 acts of quiet attention stretched across 30 years, and not one of them, as far as she could tell, ever announced. And at the bottom, the last entry, ink that was lighter than the rest, a pen that was running low maybe, or a hand that was less steady than it had once been, but legible, unmistakably legible. Seren vo, imo vo. When the time comes, BV. She had read that line many times. She was still reading it, because it was not a bequest, not technically. There was no verb in it, no specific instruction, no list of what she was receiving. It was a name, 2 names, written down in the same way everything else in this cabin had been done, with care, with intention, with the patience of someone who had learned that the way you do a thing matters as much as the thing itself. I believe in writing down the things that matter before you forget them. So Bexley had written them down, and now Seren was the one who knew. And someday, not soon, she was 19, she had time, she had a whole life of precisely made things ahead of her. Someday she would open a notebook of her own, and she would start a list, and she would write down names the way Bexley had written names, with the same care, the same unhurried attention, the same absolute confidence that the right piece would find the right clock. The pocket watch ticked in her palm. Outside, the evening settled over the clearing. The creek talked to itself in the dark. The white pines at the edge of the property moved in the slow wind, the tops of them invisible against a sky that was doing something complicated with the last of the light. She was 19 years old. She had $23. She'd spent it on a bus ticket to Stowe, Vermont. It was the best $23 she had ever spent. Inside the workshop, the tall case clock kept its steady count. 8 clocks now, all running, all different, all doing their job in their own time. No two the same, but together making something a sound, a presence, a kind of evidence. Evidence that someone had been here, that someone had paid attention, that the things the world calls broken are almost never truly broken. They are only waiting for someone patient enough to listen. What does it mean when a stranger plans for you before you exist in their life? What does it mean when someone sees who you are, not who you're pretending to be, not who you're trying to become, but who you actually are, the most essential version, and decides that's worth protecting? It means you were never as alone as you thought. It means someone was always a few steps ahead, leaving pieces in the right places, trusting you to find them when the time came. If someone in your life has ever done that for you, left something behind without asking for anything in return, seen you before you saw yourself, we'd love to hear about them in the comments. Tell us who built your net.